couldn't handle it. All these young lay people across France acting by themselves on their own initiative, out of the control of the bishops, which is literally what the complaint was to Rome, and Pius X asked them to resign, which they did. And that date there of the letter of Pope Pius X was engraved on the hearts of people, 25th of August 1910, the date of that letter, the closure of the Sion movement. 2 years later, when Cardijn arrives finally in his town of Laeken, who does he link up with? Victoire Cap, a young woman who'd been formed in the Sion methods. Ferdinand Tonnet, who he'd never met before, become a founder of the YCW. He'd learnt the Sion methods in his parish right on the French border. Georges Guérin, the first chaplain of the French YCW, and himself being a member of the Sion back in that time before 1910. Cardijn invited Marc Sanier to Belgium in 1921, described it as the greatest surge of faith and apostolate that France has known since the Revolution, and in fact explicitly associated himself with the Sion. The winds of the air and the birds of the sky carry off the seed and deposit it sometimes far away, here in Belgium, and where God makes it fruitful and multiplies it, which is in fact exactly describing exactly what was happening with the YCW and what Cardijn was doing. There you see him with Georges Guérin there, putting into practice these principles, but in a new movement. It's a new generation now after the war. Now this woman, young woman Victoire Cap, described herself as a Christian feminist, was the founder of this what was called the Needleworkers Union, people working in the textile industry, small workshops basically. She also studied with Cardijn's mentor Victor Brantz. 1912, I think the date's wrong, 1911, before she met Cardijn, she writes an article on the feminine salary, divided into three parts: facts, principles, solutions. You can see the whole thing kind of almost exists before she's even met Cardijn. 1922, the women's group that she started with Cardijn, they're looking to sort of formalise their methods. In a meeting together with another priest called René van Hordenaard, they formally adopted this Cigajak method for use with all these young women's groups. So actually I believe we can say today, I'm convinced of it now, we can say that the Cigajak in this sense that the YCW uses it, was actually started with the girls groups, formally adopted in an official meeting. I've got the report of that meeting in 8th of March 1922, I think it's 8th of March, Women's Day if I'm not mistaken. I've never thought of that before, but it's in March 8, 1922 that they formally adopted that. And that's the key, that they actually adopted it as a systematic approach. Because like I say, in the Sion and all that, you can see they were using something very close to the Cigajak, but at the same time you look in different reports of different meetings, it wasn't systematic. What they did was they systematized the thing to be able to spread it around the whole world. You see what Van Hordenaar wrote in his report there. First rule, social initiation based on the inquiry. Second rule, judge in light of principles. Third rule, move to action. Now here's what he says, very interesting. Bad method. We proposed, this is the bad method, We proposed to study Rerum Novarum with one meeting on each section. Result, members get bored after 3 meetings, In other words, we start with church doctrine, this is not the way to go, It's a rejection of the doctrinal sort of top-down sort of approach. And there they say, good method. Detailed and successive inquiries on ownership, salaries, work as they appear in the milieu of life. This is the origin of what has become institutionalised 3 or 4 years later in the YCW. And you can see the whole context of the time. Also the Dominicans being Thomists almost by definition. Another Dominican, A.D. Sertilange, publishes a book in 1969 describing prudence in terms of seek, judge and act. 1925, another Dominican publishes a translation of that chapter on prudence as a book, exactly at the time when they're articulating this method of see, judge and act. So you see how the whole thing is not just the effort of one person, but it's a whole collective effort over 30, 40, even 50, 60 years of developing a method. In hindsight, it looks so obvious, see, judge and act. But of course, they were not looking backwards, they're looking forwards. And it took all those efforts over time, trial and error, to come up with this systematic approach, which we now see so simply in these 3 simple words of see, judge, act. Here's where the YCW also recognises its heritage, and even today we don't even sometimes know about it. What's the day of foundation of the YCW? 25th of August 1935, the day of the first International Congress, before the one in 57. Why 25th of August? Well, I put it to you, have a guess why. Because they specifically wanted to link themselves to, almost as a continuation of what the Sion had been doing 25 years before. And again, from there it's just a procession. In the 1951 World Congress of Lay Apostolate, where John Maloney was present, they Cardijn actually dominated that conference and turned the whole thing around from a doctrinal approach to a C. Judge Act approach. This is critical in the whole thing of Vatican II. What happened to Vatican II, in effect what happened in 1951 was a rehearsal for what they would achieve in the council 12 or 13 years later. Of course they didn't know the council was coming, but by that time they built up all the networks with all the bishops who would be the future, like Camara. Helder Camara was there in 1951. 3 months later he became a bishop. Many of the young Latin American bishops were there. In Vatican II, 12 years later, they were the ones defending the C. Judge Act approach. And we see how it went into Catholic social teaching, Mater Magistra, and at Vatican II. This is historical also. Next year is the 50th anniversary, because it was in 1964 that Vatican II formally adopted the C. Judge Act on, I think it was the 20th October 1964. Now again, this is not recognised in the history. There's this big 5-volume history of Vatican II, and they don't because they're from Italy, Italian sort of Catholic action concept, they just don't see exactly what happened in that meeting. But it's incredibly significant that they actually adopted the C. Judge Act in writing the last versions of Gaudium and Spes. There was all these bishops divided into workshops discussing different aspects of reality in Latin America and Africa and everything, doing the C. Judge Act just like young workers were doing in their home parishes back in their home diocese. And the poor person that put in charge of that was this guy called Pierre Hauptmann, died tragically in 1971. But he was a YCW chaplain. He was later the national chaplain of the Christian Workers Movement, the adult version of the YCW. And of course that's why they chose him to compile the final version of Gaudium and Spes. So all this, you can see how the whole thing is transmitted over the course of 50 years from those sources of Cardijn, and it's been transmitted into the various Vatican II documents. It'd be another talk to tell you all that happened in Vatican II, and I'd love to give it another time. But there's 3 Vatican II documents in which the C. Judge Act appears. A document on the laity, Gaudium and Spes, as I've just said, and also, interestingly enough, in the Declaration on Religious Freedom, which was the bishop in charge of that was this guy called Bishop E.J. de Smet, whose sister was a full-time worker from the YCW. De Smet was one of Cardijn's 2 greatest allies among the bishops in Belgium. And if you study that document closely, you'll see the C. Judge Act is embedded in the whole document. And in fact, it's it's almost a rehabilitation of Lamine, because it explains the whole. This is what Cardijn said in his talk in Vatican II about it. I've helped young people to act themselves, freely obeying authorities, to become adult witnesses to Christ and the gospel. Notice also these other words: conscious of being responsible, the definition of democracy of the Sion, for their sisters and brothers in the whole world. In other words, no more top-down religion imposed by authority, but, yes, we have to believe in it, and we've got to come to believe in it through applying this method of understanding the world in which we live in our own lives. So this is Cardijn's contribution to Vatican II. Sounds so simple, those three words of C. Judge Act, but when you look at it all that's gone into it, possibly not as childish as some others might have thought. But what I'd like to say just in concluding is, if you look at all these things together over that long period, I believe that altogether we can call that a Cardijn tradition. Alistair McIntyre, one of these philosophers, he says we all belong to a tradition even when we don't know it. And I think this whole thing which I've just described is a tradition. It's very important for our movement, especially if you want to renew it. It's also important for the church, because if you want to understand Vatican II, because all these things have come into Vatican II, we need to understand where they come from as well. But as has been said even this morning, this kind of thinking is not there. And if this is our heritage, if we don't make it known, there's nobody else that's going to do so. So we have to sort of understand that tradition. And if I go back to those names, the Cardijn name there, that's really not even just a course. It's a syllabus for this famous Cardijn Institute, which we've spoken about and hopefully will continue to speak about. But it's all there, laid out for us by Cardijn before his death. And I traces out, just to conclude, we started with the Sion Beach in France. This is in Kuta Beach in Indonesia, at Bali. We had some young people from Hanoi there, and our Young People for Development Network, applying the C. Judge Act in a new context. But I think that's what we've got to do. We have a tradition, which is a long and really proud tradition, and somehow on the basis by going back to that, we've also got to find ways of building it for the new generations. Thank you.